So, what I want to talk to you about today is, uh, Rachel told me that a lot of you are undergraduates, and so I'm going to introduce a couple concepts and then talk specifically about yoga and give you kind of three examples of what three communities are doing with yoga today. So, as I said before, one of my areas of research is white supremacy, and something that I like to show my students is this pyramid or iceberg that was presented to me a number of years back when I did an anti-racism training. And I think when people think of white supremacy, they think of the KKK. Maybe now today they think of Charlottesville and the alt-right. And what I'm trying to do through my teaching and my research and scholarship is explain that white supremacy is not just the acts of a few individuals or organized groups, that it is much more insidious and steeped and deep than that. And the basic idea of white supremacy, or the foundation of white supremacy, is the idea that white people are superior to all other peoples, and specifically Black people. And the idea was needed to justify the forced enslaved labor of Black people who were forcibly brought over here from West Africa. And so everything was, when you look at our economic system, our cultural systems, religious systems, political systems, everything was done to justify that initial abuse. And from there, it just kind of flourished. So if you look at this, um, how do you say, this iceberg, if you will, is you have cultural appropriation over here somewhere. I don't know if my pointer is working, but let me just click on the pointer and, oh, it's hidden. So let's do this. Can you see it now? It's over here, right? So when people think about cultural appropriation, they don't think about something that is particularly bad, that it's just kind of shallow, it's not really that big a deal. But I think the thing with white supremacy is that there's so many layers to it that if you tackle one thing, then you can start to tackle all the other things as well. And so my kind of uh, contribution to this fight is to look a little bit closer at cultural appropriation and how it connects to not only white supremacy but anti-blackness, um, and how cultural appropriation plays a role in what it means to be white. So I'm just going to go to my next slide. I think one of the things that I learned through looking at the history of yoga is that people aren't just white or Black, right? Historically, those categories come to fruition for very specific reasons. And in order to maintain white supremacy, in order to maintain power, in order to maintain the systems of enslavement and colonialism, you need white people. And so, what you have looking at the immigration history of the United States are groups of immigrants coming from Europe. And when they first come over here, they're not considered white. And then within half a generation or a generation, they become white, right? The Irish are a really good example of this. Certain groups of Jews are good examples of this. There are tons of books written on this. And what a lot of American studies people have pointed out, and this is also taught in anti racism trainings, is that when you become white, there's an exchange that's made of culture for power. And I think that exchange is really, really important to be cognizant of, because while the power might be great, there's a rootlessness that happens. And when that rootlessness happens, you're looking for something more rooted to take its place. And I think that's where you have cultural appropriation kind of take hold, that white people in this country started looking to other places for that rootedness. And I think a really great example of that is actually Henry David Thoreau, who is, many people might have read him in high school, and he's the kind of founder of this idea of civil disobedience. But what's less known about him is that he was enthralled with South Asian texts and imagined himself to be a yogi, and really looked to India and his imagined East, his mystical East, for this kind of deep, uh, sacred knowledge that he felt he couldn't get in the West, right? So I think if we start looking at cultural appropriation as a part of the larger process of whiteness, it kind of helps make a little bit more sense. And I think we can also start to have a real dialogue about it instead of, um, kind of reactionary, kind of short Twitter bylines, right? And so yes, so I'm just gonna go into three examples regarding yoga and cultural appropriation, and how different communities are kind of using yoga. So the first is white women, right? And when you look at the history of yoga in the United States, my argument is that it has been raced, gendered, and classed to be white, to be for women, and to be for um, upper to middle class women, and that the accessibility is for that particular group. And what I would add to that too, just looking at this particular slide, you can see for thin, rich white women, and so yoga has been used by white women from the time of the late 1800s through now for empowerment, for their own kind of um, bodily desires. In this case, sometimes to be thin, sometimes to be more flexible, more mindful, etc. But one trend that I just want to point out, and we can kind of discuss this because I'm just trying to put out things there for us to discuss because I know it's a larger discussion today. This caught my eye a couple weeks ago, and this is from InStyle magazine, and I did not know this, but apparently there's a whole world of a whole convergence between QAnon and yoga, just like there's a convergence, actually, interestingly enough, between yoga and anti vaxxer communities as well. And so this is kind of going back to that larger point of how parts of our culture, without us really realizing it until we actually stop and observe, really can and does reify white supremacy structures. So we really need to kind of be observant of that. You know, another group that I have found uses yoga in some really interesting ways are Black women. And this is Jessamine Stanley, and she's become quite social media, Instagram famous, if you will. And she really has driven the conversation about yoga and body positivity forward in some really interesting and I think healthy ways, really kind of turning the conversation away from yoga being just for physical fitness and for overall health. One of the things that you see when you look at the history of yoga is um, that one of the selling points, if you will, that the early yogis from India brought over to the United States is that yoga was not just scientific, but also healthy. It helped you slow your heart rate down. It helped you have a longer life, helped you be more flexible. And for those of you who practice yoga, might feel some of those benefits. And so, what's really interesting about Jessamine Stanley is that she's involved in trying to change the face of yoga from a very thin white woman to someone who's got some roles like all of us, who's got dark skin, and I think that's a positive a move in the positive direction from the time I started researching this, gosh, about 15 years ago now. So and then I just wanted to show you another slide. Another thing that I am finding really interesting in the world of Black yoga, if you will, is the use of yoga to heal past traumas, to be kind of a balm or a salve for um, race based stress. And this woman who actually lives in Detroit, her name is Gail Parker, an African American psychologist, scholar. She has come out with this book, Restorative Yoga for Ethnic and Race Based Stress and Trauma. And you really see a whole field kind of emerging of how yoga can help with this type of trauma and stress. There already is a very, very robust field of trauma based yoga, and this is kind of an offshoot of it. What I found really interesting from this past summer is how at certain Black Lives Matter protests, there were actually yoga classes there or yoga times, stoppages to do yoga together as a community, um, and that they chose yoga over other exercises was really interesting to me, just because the other thing about how yoga has been kind of marketed or brought over to the United States is not that it's just good for stretching or flexibility or health, but that it also has a mystical or spiritual element to it. That it's universal, not necessarily Hindu, but definitely has something deeper than just, let's say, Pilates. So I feel like you see Black women yogi communities really kind of latching on to that part of um, of the yoga world, right? So, and then I just want to look at South Asian women too, because historically, South Asian women have been kind of left out of the conversation. If you look at yoga journal covers from like 1975 through today, I don't think you'll see one South Asian woman on the cover. I've looked at most of them, and I've seen East Asian women on the cover. I've seen Black women. I've seen Latino women. I haven't seen anyone overtly indigenous or South Asian identifying on the cover of the yoga journal. And I don't think that that's a mistake. What you will see in the yoga journal are South Asian men, especially South Asian yoga teacher men. That's not probably the right way to say that, but South Asian men who are yoga teachers like Iyengar or Pratabi Joyce. And sometimes inside the covers, you'll see images of Indian goddesses like Kali or Durga, who are often a little bit more, what's the word, kind of fierce goddesses. But beyond that, you really won't see South Asian women. And that's something that really kind of struck me in my research. And South Asian women have noticed that too, because the Yoga Journal is probably the journal of record when it comes to yoga in the United States. And so, someone I know by the name of Susanna Barkataki, she started this kind of online class, kind of conference called Honor, Don't Appropriate Yoga, where she asked different South Asian women and other women of color and some white women to talk about this subject. Full disclosure, she asked me, but I just felt like because I'm researching it, I probably shouldn't be a part of it. Um, but she's making some interesting points about the decolonization of yoga and how yoga in this country has been overly commodified and kind of taken away from its roots, right? I think in general, and this is probably one of the reasons why I felt it was best not to participate in this. For me, decolonization is really a problematic term to use in the South Asian context for two reasons. One is Hindu nationalists historically have used the term to kind of try to talk about reclaiming Hinduism from British colonialism. And in that process of their decolonization, can be very Islamophobic and really casteist. the other issue I think with decolonization is that it's rooted very much in Native American, indigenous philosophy. And a big part of decolonization in that context is land back, is, not just a kind of diversifying of something, but also like an actual action that one needs to take in order to restore or, for lack of a better term, decolonize. And so I'm really hesitant about using that term, even in academic settings. I used to, but now I'm just kind of feeling a little bit more like I need to rethink that. And I often ask myself, is decolonization even possible without indigenous leadership and really just giving land back, right? That's the new um, activist hashtag for that particular movement. So, but there is definitely talk about this in terms of what role do South Asian women play in terms of reclaiming yoga? And there's a long history in South Asia of women and yoga that is often ignored. If you just look at the sculptures from the 9th, 10th centuries on the sides of temples, you will see women doing yoga, women doing different breathing practices, women uh, turned in such ways that they have to have done some of those asanas in order to move their body that way. So there's this conversation occurring right now, and it's just something that I'm trying to listen in on. um, the other thing is, I've noticed that there's a podcast called Yoga is Dead, and it really is what's the word, criticizing capitalism, criticizing cultural appropriation, criticizing the role that white women have had and how yoga has become in the United States. It's a really interesting podcast. I haven't listened to all of them, but what I do find interesting is that they have a bunch of products. So they're kind of criticizing capitalism, but also kind of participating in it as well in some really interesting ways. And I'm just trying to be a fly on the wall and see how this particular conversation evolves. So, um, and then I just have one more slide. And so I just wanted to give some kind of concluding questions for us to all kind of think about together. Um, and hopefully I can answer some of them for you or answer other questions. But one is, how can yoga and cultural appropriation be a lens for us to better nuance our understanding of how race and white supremacy works in the United States? Um, I think when we look at race in the United States, we're often in this like kind of black white binary. So, how does the case study of yoga kind of complicate that binary? And then, how do each of the three groups that I featured here today, with some examples, reify and or resist the larger cultural pattern of how yoga has been race, gendered, and classed in the United States? So I'll conclude there. I think I hit just about 20 minutes. I told Dr. Lindsay I would do that. So yes, I will turn it back over to her. I gotta stop sharing the screen. Okay.
All right. Thank you so much, Dr. Gandhi. You gave us so much to think with. I'll let you take a breath, drink some water. We've got a few questions coming in. Um, uh, I think maybe one, if I can sort of jump in here myself until we get a couple of undergrad questions. So I'm looking at you if you're in my classes. Um, drop those questions in. Um, what I really found compelling about your remarks today is this sort of resistance to framing um, cultural appropriation of yoga as sort of a recovery of some pure or true yogic practice, right?
Yeah.
And instead asking us to sort of think about within these broader structures of power, and especially these long histories of white supremacy and race in the U.S. Um, and I couldn't help, and I know your talk is about yoga, um, and I'm sure that we've got a lot. We already have a bunch of questions coming in right now, but I was particularly struck sort of with the ways in which this argument also resonates with other practices like Peloton, right?
Mhm.
So I don't know if you're into that at all. I'm sort of I have my toe in it. But just sort of talking about these ways of finding rootedness in these sort of physical practices, right? Um, and
Yeah.
so my question, the ways in which these sort of physical practices become spiritualized, right? Um, um, I guess my question is sort of is there something particular about the unrootedness of this present moment that asks us to think more directly about race and structures of power that's different from previous areas, or is this sort of a consistent narrative over American history?
Right. So first, thank you for that first point because I think it's really important that um, that I don't know that there's anything like the possibility of recovery is fraught with so many layers of problematics for lack of a better term right now, right? This idea that we can go back and find an origin to any sort of practice or tradition or culture, I think gets us close to nativism and fascism in some ways. And so I really try to resist that in my scholarship. So thank you for noticing that because I think a lot of people when they hear cultural appropriation of yoga, they come to me and they're like, so what's the true practice of yoga? And I'm like, that's not something that I can answer, and I don't think it's necessarily answerable, and I don't think it's responsible to answer, right? Which is why I have issues with the decolonization of yoga rhetoric in general. I think that the unrootedness is a part of a longer history of yoga in the or just a longer history in general of whiteness in the United States. I'll just give you one example. There's this guy by the name of William Atkinson who is known, become kind of famous in American religious histories as being someone who's like a new thought kind of guy who, kind of a groovy thinker in the early 20th century, right? And I think the history of New Thought is a little bit overstated in American religious history, but that's just me. And uh, but what a lot of people don't know about William Atkinson is that he had an Indian kind of he did like Indian blackface for lack of better term. He had another identity called Swami Ramacharaka, and he wrote quite a few books under that pseudonym and basically invented the story of how he was a swami from India. And I'm like, why would this guy do this, right? And I think if you look at William Atkinson as just kind of a thinker and a kind of eccentric, it's like, oh, okay, whatever. But if you look at him as a white man, right, and someone who um, participated, his family, his ancestry participated in the kind of process of becoming white, it makes sense that he would look to something that he imagined as kind of ancient and mystical to parlay his ideas, right? And that would give him a little bit more authenticity than just plain old William Atkinson, So I think there's a longer history here, but I do think that as we get closer and closer to being a majority minority country where white people are a minority but still kind of the biggest chunk, we're seeing more kind of, I think, anxiety around whiteness and a little bit more examination of it. I think that that's a good thing, and so I hope that my small contribution is just a part of this larger conversation on what it means to be white, what it means to operate in the world as white or as brown, and how can we kind of root out our anti-blackness because I think that's key to dismantling white supremacy. And how do we raise children and have an education system that exposes and explores this rather than reifies and hides this?
Excuse me, I was on mute. Uh, we have all sorts of questions coming in, and this is from, I apologize if I mispronounce your name, Siley Pawaskar, who is, I believe, a student here at St. Louis University. And she says, "Thank you for coming to talk to us tonight, Dr. Gandhi. This is a topic that is super interesting to me as a biracial woman of white and Indian descent. In what ways does the language used in mainstream yoga, the erasure of the Sanskrit glossary for terms such as the star pose and the tree pose, further perpetuate white supremacy?" I think that's a
Yeah,
great question.
that's a really great question, and so I guess I would have two comments on this. Is one, when we look at Sanskrit as a language, I think it's really important to look at Sanskrit in the context of South Asia. And in the context of South Asia, Sanskrit is a language that is not really used anymore, right? Is used, but when it is used, it's used by Brahmins. And we have to remember that South Asia um, has a very long and troubled history of caste, and where Brahmins are at the top and people who are Dalits are at the bottom, and that there are people kind of in between. And so I'm actually not as troubled by as other people by the kind of erasure of Sanskrit, because Sanskrit in and of itself has erased so many non-Brahmin voices, especially the voices of Dalit people in South Asia. So when we look at South Asia in general, you have to realize like there's so many languages. There are over, I think, 15 official languages, and then so many different dialects and subdialects, and the majority of people don't have access to Sanskrit, nor do they use Sanskrit. And I think the use of Sanskrit by certain yogis in the practice of yoga, when yoga was first coming over here, not only in the late 1800s, early 1900s, but also in the 1960s and 70s, was a way of continuing this idea of yoga as mystical and spiritual and ancient, and Sanskrit gave authority to that idea. And so I guess that's one, right? So, how does the use of the language Sanskrit reify certain Brahmanical patriarchal ideas of what yoga is and what Hinduism is and what South Asia should be? So, that's one. And two, in terms of the translation from Sanskrit to English, uh, I guess I guess in some ways you could see it as kind of a privileging of English over Sanskrit, but um, I think also sometimes the overuse of Sanskrit, like the use of Namaste, for example, and all the reiterations of that, and the kind of ideology that really means I don't know, I see the light in you and you see the light in me, or something like that. I don't know what people say it is, but namaste is used in Hindi and it really just means hello, right? And so I just think that I don't know if I'm doing a great job answering your question or answering it necessarily the way that you were thinking, but I think we have to look at the other different types of layers and nuances in language when looking at the larger question of Sanskrit. I hope that answers your question. So I don't necessarily think that translation is um, furthering white supremacy. I think it's all part of a larger oppressive supremacist system that we have to uh, carefully analyze and carefully be cognizant of.
Thank you. We have a number of questions coming in that are sort of exploring this tension between approach and practice. And we had, but what I'll do is I'll ask a question submitted by Chloe. And Chloe asked, is it possible for white women like myself to practice yoga without appropriating? Or is that not possible? And if not possible, should white women not be practicing?
Okay. Thank you. That's a really thoughtful question. Um, one thing I would say is that we live in this world, and I'm sure you guys are all feeling maybe, my God, we're at home, COVID, election, coup, all this stuff is going on. My classes, I have to be, I'm away from some people are away from their families. These are difficult times, and anything that will help your mental health, that will help your physical health, that will help your happiness, um, especially when it is in regards to yoga, I would never say to anyone, don't do that, right? I think cultural appropriation is on a spectrum. And when you're looking at, let's say, cultural appropriation of Native American traditions or African American traditions, and those communities say, don't do that, please, I think based on the type of colonialism and enslavement and trauma that they've experienced, we should honor that and listen to that, right? I think when looking at colonialism in the South Asian context, cultural appropriation is somewhat different. I think, people wearing bindis or saris and stuff is a little shallow, but something like yoga, Chloe, if it helps you, if it's good for your health right now, I would never say to anyone, don't do it. And I don't know that any South Asian would. I think the way in which yoga has been presented to the United States is definitely a form of appropriation. I don't think you can get away from that. But I think that we can use that to have a larger conversation about not only the history of the United States, the history of whiteness, the history of white womanhood, right? But also a larger question about health in this particular alienating time. Um, so I would just say keep practicing yoga. Especially right now. I mean, these are not easy times for anyone, and I'm particularly uh, how do you say? I'm trying to be particularly thoughtful, especially when it comes to students, because you guys are just going through the ringer, and and I think these are definitely hard times. So I hope you're doing well.
Thank you. Thank you so much for being so thoughtful and attuned to what students are experiencing right now. We've got a number of questions sort of in a similar vein here of, and this one, I'll read the one from one of our colleagues, Dr. Block, here at SLU. She writes, I would love to hear Dr. Gandhi elaborate on the distinctions between cultural appropriation of yoga and appropriate respectful engagement with and practice of yoga. And if I can be so bold as sort of to add on to her question, I'm thinking particularly about some of the forms of yoga that you've written about recently, sort of trauma informed yoga and goat yoga, and sort of the ways in which yoga has sort of become part of other cultural conversations and practices. That may or may not have been her intent, but answer in any way you want.
I really love that you guys call your university SLU. I just put that together, and I love that. But on to the question, I think one thing that when I have conversations with South Asians, with South Asian women, is one of the difficult things about this modern world is we can't control the market. We can try, right? We can say, selling people is wrong and try to regulate, the trafficking of women and young children, right? We can, copyright certain things and say, you cannot have fake whatever designer Chanel bags on the market, right? But in general, it's really hard to control the market. So you get things like yoga booty ballet, which is what inspired my journey on looking at the history of yoga, right? You get things like goat yoga, which seem um, really silly, but also seem to give people a lot of comfort. I personally don't think I would like to play with baby goats while doing yoga, but other people do. You get things like rage yoga, where people curse and drink beer in a brewery and do yoga poses, right? And so I think to some South Asians in South Asia and here, this is not respectful. And I think there's only small things that we can do to kind of curb that. We can't control the market, right? People want to and need to make money. And so if something like rage yoga makes someone a nice bit of cash, it's going to continue to happen, right? Um, but one thing that I'm starting to do is actually talk at yoga teacher trainings about how, one teacher at a time, we can try to not necessarily regulate the practice of yoga, but when people teach yoga, just be a little bit more informed about how yoga has a history beyond that of the United States and Europe, has a history beyond that of just of white women, and how it's changed over time, and how that's illustrative of how culture changes over time. So uh, I think that's the what we can kind of control a little bit. But the thing about capitalism is that it rages. It rages on and on and on. And we live in an economic system where if you want something, you can get it. So I always use this as an example in my classes. If I want this, I love this water bottle and it has my dad's hospital on it, McLaren, right? So if you want a water bottle that says McLaren or Shreena rocks or Rachel rocks, right, on it, you can get it, right? We live in a system where we can just go on the internet, Google it, Etsy it, and we can get it, right? And when someone tells us no, then that's when we go a little crazy. No, how can you tell us no? We can get this bottle with my name on it, so why can't I do this or why can't I do that? And I think even suggesting that really hits a nerve, and I think it hits that kind of larger nerve about that rootlessness, right? And so yeah, I don't know that it's necessarily possible to be a totally 100% respectful, because capitalism is not totally 100% respectful. Capitalism is a system that exploits. And so anything that comes out of it is going to be exploitive as well. But you can kind of use the observation skills you learn in yoga in terms of watching your breath and watching your body to turn that outward and watch the world, observe the world. And yeah, does that answer the question? I kind of feel like I went off on a little bit of a tangent with the water bottle, but yeah.
That's great.
Thank you, Shreena. We have many questions here, so here's one by Cheyenne Miller. Hello, Cheyenne out there. I know you from one of my classes, and she is an undergraduate at SLU. She asks, well, first she says, thank you so much for sharing your insight. Does appropriation of yoga happen within the upper classes of Indian Hindu society as well? Or unrootedness would be a better phrase?
I think when you're looking at the upper classes of South Asia, um, and particularly the upper castes, uh, you're not really looking at an issue of unrootedness, but you are looking at a different form of supremacy. Um, And so oftentimes yoga is used by Brahmins to exhibit or perform that supremacy at the expense of generations of Dalits and Dalit women in particular who helped make the practice what it is today. But those stories and histories are forgotten and hidden and not documented in the same way as the histories and contributions of Brahmin men. So I think you're looking at two different things there, but it's definitely important to realize that just as we have inequity here, we have a lot of inequity in South Asia as well that needs to be worked on.
Thank you. Our next question comes from Jada. And Jada says, thanks so much for enlightening us with your research and knowledge, Dr. Gandhi. This has been extremely eye-opening and thought-provoking. I'm curious to know what challenges you hope to see within the community. Specifically, how can it better represent its history and roots?
Are you in terms of the practice of yoga, like what I hope to see? Yes. I think I'm seeing just I've had a number of teacher training groups reach out to me to talk to um, their classes. And I think, what's really been inspiring and interesting to me is to one have white people really listen to me about this and really think about this in a larger context, um, in terms of examining whiteness in their own lives beyond yoga, right? Because yoga is just an example. There's so much more to this, right? The other thing that I'm really loving seeing is this move that's led by Black women of body positivity in yoga, because not everyone's body can do, you know, that weird scorpion pose of the image I showed you, and not every body is supposed to do that, and I think that's okay, and not every body is supposed to look like one way, and I think this kind of move to make yoga a little bit more inclusive, a little bit more democratized and accessible is really important. And then the other thing that I'm really kind of keeping my eye on and really kind of inspired by is seeing how yoga is being used in various social justice movements, whether it's Black Lives Matter or there's a really interesting teacher out in Seattle whose name is escaping me, but she's a white woman who uses yoga to examine white supremacy, to kind of be a safe space for people of color, and she's gotten a lot of heat for that, but she's doing some really interesting things. And so those are the kind of things that I'm just really interested to see how that kind of evolves. And the other thing I'm just keeping my eye on is this kind of QAnon and yoga convergence, and see where that goes, because I'm just keeping an eye on that in general.
Yes, that's fascinating. I didn't. Fascinating is one word for it, I guess.
Yes.
Uh, um, excellent. So I'm going to ask a question from Nana, and I apologize if I am mispronouncing your name. As a Black woman, yoga has been a wonderful and loving practice that has deepened my own spiritual beliefs and helped me heal from trauma. However, I have never felt comfortable ending my asana practice with namaste. What is your opinion of using Afrocentric terms or other phrases such as peace and love?
I'm really glad that you find yoga useful for healing from racial trauma. That sends chills down my arm and makes me incredibly happy. I also understand you not feeling comfortable with namaste. I am, when I go to yoga classes and people say that, I don't say that. I think it's a word that again is used to kind of give more of a mystical, spiritual, deep, authentic vibe to yoga, when I don't think you really need to do that. And as I said before, namaste is used by just a certain population of people in India just to say hi and bye. And my family is from East Africa, from Uganda. So, but we're Gujaratis. I never heard that term until I went to a yoga class. So I completely understand your hesitation with it. And I think if you wanted to use peace, love, you know, goodbye, whatever feels most comfortable to you, I would use it, especially because you're using yoga to um, to deal with the centuries of of your ancestors and your trauma. And I think that you have the right in many ways. One thing that I've been kind of talking on Twitter about recently is Cardi B's use of um, the goddess Durga for her latest advert. And one thing I just said to a colleague of mine on Twitter is that it sometimes just feels different when you have Black folks using Hindu imagery and stuff versus like white folks. Like I was like, it's the difference between like Beyonce and Iggy Azalea. And so I think that there's just a different conversation to have there. And yes, I think using peace, love uh, would be great. It was, if that feels right to you, that's what I would do. Especially because Namaste is so fraught. And if you want to read more about it, my a good friend and colleague Romeo Pucha has written quite a bit about Namaste and the ways in which it's been kind of perverted.
All right, so we have another question we have is from one of your colleagues out here in California. Anna Bigelow asks, she says,
Anna.
one thing that you are pointing out that is so critical, yay, Shreena, is that what runs through all these critiques is what cultural formations are served by these interpretations or uses of yoga, which is why there's a difference between those usages that we see all phenomena, such as yoga, as their prerogative to use and distort as they see fit, versus those who are from historically disempowered and excluded positions, using those resources that most facilitate their survivance. And then she has in parentheses, I don't know this reference, but you will, to evoke Vezenor.
Yeah. So is what runs through all these critiques is what cultural for are served by his interpretations. Um, I I don't know what the question is per se, because I completely understand. I completely agree with everything you're saying,
Mhm.
Anna. Um,
I
and
see her as asking what's it serving when they use these traditions? What is it
right,
serving? Is it distorting it for some negative reason to hoard power maybe, or is it adopting these practices to, I think she uses the word survivance.
yeah.
That's what I gathered.
I guess I would say that um, the kind of adaptation of these practices, the adaptation of certain textiles or art forms, music forms from colonized cultures is one way to sustain the power of the colonized culture, or of the colonizer culture, I should say. And, kind of yoga is one of those artifacts that was kind of brought back along with various, as I said before, textiles, gems, uh, books, etc. And so I don't know if it's necessarily done to help the survival of a culture, but rather to kind of reify the power of the colonizer culture. So when we look at the history of yoga, I don't think it's an accident that it was used for the empowerment of white women, um, per se. But I guess she sent a clarification in the question and answer. So let me just look at this. Not a question so much as whether you see this as a kind of survivance. Um, I guess it could be a kind of survivance, but I don't necessarily think yoga would not survive had it not been for colonialism. I think all these cultures would have survived. I just think because of colonialism and capitalism, they survived in a different way. And I guess I'm just interested in that impact more than um, more than anything else. If that answers, I hope that answers your question, Anna. Hi, I wish I could see you.
Our next question comes from Emily, and Emily asks, um, Ooh, it went away. Okay, there we go. What do you make of the growing prevalence of yoga in early childhood education, as many schools are beginning to teach mindfulness and yoga?
Yeah.
She asks, is there a way to do that well?
Um, I don't know that I'm qualified to answer the question of whether there's a way to do it well or not. I do know that it has caused a lot of angst in certain public schools and certain parents that yoga is being taught in gym class. And then in other communities, like the community where I live in, my nieces signed up to take yoga this next trimester over Zoom. So we'll see how that goes. There was a big case in California regarding this. Full disclosure again, I was asked to be on the amicus brief arguing against it. I uh, said no for various reasons, but the number one reason being that the law firm that was representing the parents was anti yoga in schools, but also pro prayer in schools, and they were also super homophobic. But I just felt like if you're gonna be against yoga in schools, you should be also against prayer in schools, and um, yeah, so I think there's a lot of angst around it in certain communities. uh, I think for some kids it probably works really well. My grandparents had me meditating when I was like 5 or 6 years old. Like if I was, whatever, they would be like, sit down and observe your breath. And, they were Vipassana meditation teachers. And so I grew up with that, and but never in public school. So it's really interesting to see how it's being used in schools and public schools, and how there's a whole new kind of industry around it as well. The other thing that I'll just want to mention is that there's this woman by the name of Laurette Willis who has something called the Christian alternative to yoga. It's called Praise Moves. And she has a system for public schools to adopt um, that is her alternative to yoga, because she feels yoga is demonic. But the poses that she has looks exactly like yoga, but you know, so there's alternatives out there to it. As to whether how to do it well, I'm definitely not qualified to answer that, and so I'll defer to people who actually are doing that work in public schools and in private schools. But it's definitely something to watch. And again, this is why I think a really nuanced understanding of yoga is important, because yoga is not rooted in any one religious system. I would say the bulk of yoga comes from Hinduism, but there's also Jain yoga, there's Buddhist yoga, there's Sikh yoga, and in this country you have Christian yoga, Muslim yoga from India as well as Jewish yoga, right? So long kind of histories and robust kind of traditions of that. So
Just following that thread, and thinking back to your remarks, is it fair to call yoga a religious practice today?
I think in some contexts, yes. I think in other contexts, it is a totally secular practice, and I think you know it doesn't necessarily say much about yoga per se, right? There are some people that are going to insist that it's religious and some people that are going to insist that it's secular. But I think it's a really interesting lens into that religious secular divide. And, again, one thing I always stress is that culture changes over time. So practices are going to change over time. And why they change the way they do and how they change the way they do says a lot more about our culture than anything else. And so that's what I would like to pay attention to, because when you start paying attention to that, then you start getting a lens into how our culture works, the good parts about our culture in terms of how it uplifts people, and the parts about our culture that continues to oppress. And yoga is one kind of avenue into better understanding that.
I think we've got time for maybe two more questions. Um, One, sort of just to summarize a number of questions that have come in here. Um, uh, I appreciate your drawing attention to the history of white supremacy and appropriation. Would you say more about how yoga is gendered and classed?
Right. So when you have the first South Asian man that comes to the United States to talk at the World Parliament of Religions in 1893 is this guy by the name of Swami Vivekananda. And Swami Vivekananda came to talk about Hinduism and what is Hinduism. He also came to raise money, right, which is something that a lot of people don't always know about him. And because he had his guru was this guy by the name of Swami Ramakrishna, and he wanted to raise money for a charity, for lack of a better term, or a mission in I guess would be East India, called the Ramakrishna Mission in Muth, right? And Muth is like is a term for kind of a monk, a place for monks to be, you know. And so he came to the United States and realized there's a ton of money. And the other thing about Swami Vivekananda is that he caught the attention of a lot of women, particularly white women, because apparently he was very handsome and charismatic. And he raised a ton of money from white women for setting up the Vedanta Society here in the United States, as well as setting up the Ramakrishna Mission in Muth in India. And one thing that he did is he specifically sought out um, white women for this to teach them yoga. And the type of yoga he taught them was mainly different types of breathing. And the other thing that he did is that he um, said to them that yoga can be complementary to your Christian practice, so that you can have a small space in your home um, practicing yoga, but then you can go to church on Sunday. So from the very beginning, Vivekananda and then later people like Yogananda, Sukul, and then the other various white men that also became yogis really targeted uh, or kind of presented yoga as something that could be empowering to white women. And then later on, you have people like Richard Hittleman using yoga to say this is good for white women's bodies, right? So yoga was always kind of marketed to that particular group. Um, and so the face of yoga became gendered uh, woman, right? And in terms of how it's been classed, yoga historically has not been accessible to people who could not afford it, right? Even today in certain yoga studios, you have classes that are $20, $30, $40 for half an hour, for an hour. A lot of people can't afford that. And so now we have some yoga studios that are doing things on a sliding scale or doing it, you know, kind of for free and asking people who can pay more to pay more. But the other thing that I look at in my research that I didn't talk about today is the exhaustive amount of yoga products, whether they're yoga pants, yoga mats, yoga jewelry, um, different yoga accessories, and that all costs a ton of money. So, you know, I wrote a chapter for a book on yoga in the United States, and one of the things that I talked about are Lululemon yoga pants, which can be $100 just for one little pair. And then on top of that, like the owner of Lululemon is like, if you're under a size, you know, if you're over a size 12, you're not supposed to wear them. You know, you know, and if you look at the price of different yoga pants and tops and mats. I mean, some of these mats cost like $100 to $200, and you're like, what is special about this mat? When I did my first class in yoga in India, gosh, about 10, 15 years ago now, and women were using just like blankets or nothing and in their saris doing the yoga. So there's definitely like a market around yoga that classes it as somewhat inaccessible, because the fact of the matter is that this is a multi-billion-dollar industry. So I hope that answers your questions.
Yeah, thank you. I actually have a question that sort of is zooming out a little bit, and it's essentially like, why yoga? So why is yoga the sort of practice that's been appropriated and come to define the bounds of whiteness versus some other practice, although there are many others. But
Yeah.
what is it about yoga? I guess basically is my question.
Well, I think so. I mean, you do have other practices from the kind of mystical East or mystical Asia that have come over here. I think a lot about the martial arts. You also have the attempt to kind of bring over tantra as like kind of like a sexual revolution, sexual free practice. But I think the thing with yoga is one, it's very accessible, right? You don't need it's easy to make money with yoga, right? Uh, it's I think I have a line in my book like I'm just I can't remember what exactly I wrote, but something to the effect of, you don't need anything to sell yoga, but you can create a lot of products around it, right? And the other thing about yoga, which I kind of alluded to earlier with Chloe's question, is that it can work, right? It works for people. People do it and they feel a sense of lightness sometimes. They feel like they've been stretched. We talked about namaste, but one thing that we didn't talk about is om. And to me, om is much more useful in the practice of yoga because if you guys have ever said it, and you can say it right now, and you say om, right, you can actually feel the vibration through your entire body the longer you say it, right? And that's something that's visceral, that's tangible, that not only engages the mind, but also the body. And I think we live in a world right now where our bodies are not as engaged as they need to be, and it's become even worse during these COVID times where we're kind of separated from people. We can't even touch our loved ones, and so we're even more alienated. And I think what yoga does is, for a lot of people, it, um, as I said before, provides a kind of rootedness to your own body, right, and rootedness to another culture that feels that 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 feels grounded and, as I said before, mystical, authentic, ancient, all those things that maybe we feel like sometimes we're missing in our own lives. So I think that's kind of one reason why yoga has become so incredibly popular, if we're looking at that kind of larger kind of landscape, as you said. Does that answer your question, Elizabeth?
Shreena, thank you so much for all your time. It's been wonderful having you here with us by Zoom for this hour. If there are any other questions, you can email us. And I think Professor Gandhi has been incredibly gracious and will be interested in engaging you. Do you have any concluding comments, Shreena?
Well, so my email is a really fun email. MSU gave it to me and I love it. It's Gandhish, like a little bit Gandhi, at msu.edu. So GANDHISH. And so if you want to email me questions or comments or whatever, I'd love to hear from you, especially the community members and undergraduates and really everyone. But I just want to say thank you. This has been a really great conversation, and I hope that you got something out of it. Anytime I'm forced to kind of speak publicly about it, I feel like I crystallize and solidify my thoughts a little bit better and a little bit more. So I really appreciate that. So thank you.
And we're excited to see your book come out.
Me too.
Soon, right? So we'll be looking for it.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thanks.
Thank you.